Okay, so it's the 31st of March, excuse me. It's a Tuesday morning. Looks like we're going to be finishing Deuteronomy this morning. The format here is we read through a chapter of the Bible and then read John Wesley's commentary on it, and then I've taken to sharing some of my own thoughts. Sometimes I try not to preach very long at all, but sometimes I know a little bit about the scriptural text or the historical context that I think is just helpful for anyone trying to understand what the Bible says. I sometimes begin with a poem. This one is by Charles Wesley, written in 1762. It's called Come Divine Interpreter. I've said it a few times. Come Divine Interpreter, bring me eyes thy book to read, ears the mystic words to hear, words which did from thee proceed, words that endless bliss impart, kept in my obedient heart. All who read or hear are blessed, if thy plain commands we do. Of thy kingdom here possessed, thee we shall in glory view. When thou comest on earth to abide, will reign triumphant at thy side. Our chapter 32 ended with Moses reciting a song in testimony against the people Israel for their faithlessness that has been seen in the wilderness and that will surely be seen as they enter into the promised land. And then there's a short dialogue between God and Moses as Moses is told to stay behind as the Israelites move into the Holy Land and to die on Mount Nebo. Okay, chapter 33. Listen to the word of God. And this is the blessing wherewith Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. And he said, the Lord came from Sinai and rose up from Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. Yea, he loved the people. All his saints are in thy hand. And they sat down at thy feet. Every one shall receive of thy words. Moses commanded us a law, even the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. And he was king in Jeshurun, when the heads of the people and the tribes of Israel were gathered together. Let Reuben live and not die, and let not his men be few. And this is the blessing of Judah. And he said, hear, Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him unto his people. Let his hands be sufficient for him, and be thou a help to him from his enemies. And of Levi he said, let thy Thummim and thy Urim be with thy Holy One, whom thou didst prove at Massa, and with whom thou didst strive at the waters of Meribah, who said unto his father and to his mother, I have not seen him, neither did he acknowledge his brethren, nor knew his own children, for they have observed thy word and kept thy covenant. They shall teach Jacob thy judgments, and Israel thy law. They shall put incense before thee, and whole burnt sacrifice upon thine altar. Bless, Lord, his substance, and accept the work of his hands. Smite through the loins of them that rise against him, and of them that hate him, that they rise not again. And of Benjamin he said, the beloved of the Lord shall dwell in safety by him, and the Lord shall cover him all the day long, and he shall dwell between his shoulders. And of Joseph he said, blessed of the Lord be his land, for the precious things of heaven, for the dew, and for the deep that coucheth beneath, and for the precious fruits brought forth by the sun, and for the precious things put forth by the moon, and for the chief things of the ancient mountains, and for the precious things of the lasting hills, and for the precious things of the earth and fullness thereof, and for the goodwill of him that dwelt in the bush. Let the blessing come upon the head of Joseph, and upon the top of the head of him that was separated from his brethren. His glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. And of Zebulun he said, Rejoice, Zebulun, in thy going out, and Issachar in thy tents. They shall call the people unto the mountain. There they shall offer sacrifices of righteousness, for they shall suck of the obedience of the seas, and of the treasures hid in the sand. I said obedience, it's abundance. They shall suck of the abundance of the seas, and of the treasures hid in the sand. And of Gad he said, Blessed be that enlargeth Gad. Be he that enlargeth Gad. He dwelleth as a lion, and teareth the arm with the crown of the head. And he provided the first part for himself, because there in a portion of the lawgiver was he seated. And he came with the heads of the people. He executed the justice of the Lord, and his judgments with Israel. And of Dan he said, Dan is a lion's whelp. He shall lead from Bashan. And of Naphtali he said, O Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full with the blessing of the Lord, possess thou the west and the south. And of Asher he said, Let Asher be blessed with children. Let him be acceptable to his brethren, and let him dip his foot in oil. Thy shoes shall be iron and brass, and as thy days, so shall thy strength be. There is none like unto God in Jeshurun, who rideth upon the heaven in thy help, and in his excellency on the sky. The eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. And he shall thrust out the enemy from before thee, and shall say, Destroy them. Israel then shall dwell in safety alone. The fountain of Jacob shall be upon a land of corn and wine. Also his heavens shall drop down dew. Happy art thou, O Israel. Who is like unto thee, O people saved by the Lord, the shield of thy help? And who is the sword of thy excellency? And thine enemies shall be found liars unto thee, and thou shalt tread upon their high places. Thus ends the reading, chapter 33. The way that John Wesley lines it out, he calls this whole chapter the blessing of Moses. He pronounces them all blessed in what God has done for them already in verses 1 through 5. He pronounces a blessing upon each individual tribe in verses 6 through 25. He pronounces them all in general blessed on account of what God would be to them and do for them if they were obedient in verses 26 through 29. Verse 1, Moses blessed Israel. Let's go back to that quote. And this is the blessing wherewith Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. J.W. says he is said to bless them by praying to God with faith for his blessing upon them, and by foretelling the blessings which God would confer upon them. And Moses calls himself here the man of God, that is, the servant or prophet of God, to acquaint them that the following prophecies were not his own inventions, but divine inspirations. When it says he blessed the children of Israel, that means the several tribes. Only Simeon is omitted, either in detestation of their parent Simeon's bloody carriage, for which Jacob gives that tribe a curse rather than a blessing. In Genesis, 49, verses 5 through 7. Or because that tribe had no distinct inheritance, but was to have its portion in the tribe of Judah, according to Joshua 19, verse 1. I'm going to go to Genesis 49, because I think there was another brother in that with him. (49) 5 through 7. Simeon and Levi are brethren, instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly. Mine honor be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. So this is when Jacob called unto his sons at the end of Genesis. And I'm pretty sure, well, okay, so he curses Simeon and Levi together, but Levi is the tribe of priests, so maybe they can't similarly be ignored the way that Simeon is. So yeah, that's an interesting thing. I didn't notice while we were going through it, but Simeon of the 12 tribes is the only one not to be blessed by Moses. That's weird. And the two explanations were, one, because of his, quote, I think he said bloody carriage, yeah. So the story there was, well, see, I'm not sure which two sons it was. I'm going to go ahead and tell it because it's an interesting story, but the 12 sons of Jacob, they had a sister named Dinah, and there was a local guy who found her in a field and raped her, and he fell in love with her, and he wanted to marry her. So his father came to Jacob and said, hey, we would like to get our kids hitched. And Jacob and his sons said, no, we can only marry people who've been circumcised. And so they had this whole, not just this man and his son, but the whole city, in order for them to establish diplomatic relations, had to have their men circumcised. And so they did it. Apparently that's how wonderful Dinah was. But anyway, Simeon and Levi, I think, right after the men had circumcised themselves, well, it was the day after, they were all super sore. They just walked into the city and killed all the men out of vengeance for Dinah's rape. So Jacob didn't approve of that. Although, it's not clear to me if it's not, there was kind of a wink-wink thing going on. I don't know. But yeah, so it's either because of that or because in Joshua we learned that Simeon doesn't get a distinct inheritance, that it's tied to the tribe of Judah. So I don't know. In verse 2, there's the phrase, the Lord came, quote, and he said, the Lord came from Sinai and rose up from Seir unto them. And I find this interesting because the whole book he's been calling it Horeb, not Sinai. But here it says the Lord came from Sinai and rose up from Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. So when it says the Lord came, JW says, namely to the Israelites, manifested himself graciously and gloriously among them. When it says from Sinai, it means beginning at Sinai, where the first appearance of God was, and so going on with them to Seir and Paran. When it says he rose up, quote, and he came with 10,000s of men. Oh, no, wait. The Lord came from Sinai and rose up from Seir unto them. He appeared or showed himself as the sun doth when it riseth. So it's using sun imagery for God, I guess. When it talks about Seir, S-E-I-R, that's from the mountain land of Edom, the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, to which place the Israelites came in Numbers chapter 20, verse 14. And from thence God led them on towards the land of promise, and then gloriously appeared for them in subduing Sihon and Og before them. Those were Ammonite kings. But because the land of Edom is sometimes taken more largely, and so reacheth even to the Red Sea, and therefore Mount Sinai was near to it, and because Paran was also near Sinai, being the next station into which they came from the wilderness of Sinai, all this verse may belong to God's appearance in Mount Sinai, where that glorious light which shone upon Mount Sinai directly did in all probability scatter its beams into adjacent parts, such as Seir and Paran were. I don't know about that. And if so, this is only a poetical expression of the same thing in diverse words, and God coming or rising or shining from or to or in Sinai and Seir and Paran. Note one and the same illustrious action of God, appearing there with 10,000s of his saints or holy angels, and giving a fiery law to them. So saints is just holy ones. That's all saints. So it's not clear if it's talking about angels or humans. And it seems unlikely that it's talking about humans, because it's there at Sinai that these humans, the Israelites, immediately fall into idolatry while Moses is up on the mountain. But there was a moment before Moses went up when people understood the gravity of the situation, and they begged Moses to intercede for them, and they were in fear of the Lord and agreed to be in covenant with him. So, it could be talking about humans there, maybe, when it's talking about saints. I just think it's weird to refer, that's an English translation issue, but how often in the Bible are angels called holy ones? I don't know. When it talks about Paran, that's a place where God eminently manifested his presence and goodness, both in giving the people flesh which they desired, and in appointing the 70 elders and pouring forth his Spirit upon them. So that's in Exodus. No, that's in Numbers. When it talks about with 10,000s of saints, that is with a great company of holy angels, according to Psalm 68, according to, verse 17, Psalm 68, 17. The chariots of God are 20,000, even thousands of angels. The Lord is among them, as in Sinai, in the holy place. Oh, that's a good reference. So the notion being at Sinai, not only God the Father manifested himself, but also there were thousands of angels present. That's according to Psalm 69. I'm so glad I looked that up. That's interesting. Then it references Daniel 7, verse 10. And that's also a manifestation of the heavenly host, which attended upon him in great and glorious work of giving the law, as may be gathered from Acts chapter 7, verse 53, Galatians 3, verse 19. When it talks about from his right hand, and we're still in verse 2, quote, he shined forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. From his right hand, which both wrote the law and gave it to men. God is right-handed, of course. He wrote the law with his right hand, he gave it to men. An allusion to men who ordinarily write and give gifts with their right hand. I don't know about that. The right hand is the preferential hand throughout the Bible. When Jesus separates the sheep from the goats, the sheep are the ones he prefers, and they're on his right hand. There's the goats on his left. I'm not sure it's made to be a statement against left-handed people. When it talks about a fiery law, the law is called fiery because it is of a fiery nature, purging and searching and inflaming, to signify that fiery wrath which it inflicteth upon sinners for the violation of it, and principally because it was delivered out of the midst of the fire. Yeah, that's all just fine by me. Jesus was a fan of fire. I came to bring fire, and how I wish it was already kindled, he said. Verse 3, it talks about the people, quote, yea, he loved the people. It's talking about God. All his saints are in thy hand, and they sat down at thy feet. Every one shall receive of thy words. It's talking about the people. It means the tribes of Israel. The sense is, this law, though delivered with fire and smoke and thunder, which might seem to portend nothing but hatred and terror, yet in truth was given to Israel in great love, as being the great means of their temporal and eternal salvation. Yea, he embraced the people and laid them in his bosom. So the word signifies, which speaks not only the dearest love, but the most tender and careful protection. All God's saints or holy ones, that is, his people, were in thy hand. So in the previous verse, the saints are angels. In this verse, it's now the people of Israel. That is, under God's care to protect, direct, and govern them. These words are spoken to God. The change of persons, his and thy, is most frequent in the Hebrew tongue. This clause may farther note God's kindness to Israel in upholding them when the fiery law was delivered, which was done so much terror that not only the people were ready to sink under it, but even Moses did exceedingly fear and quake. But God sustained both Moses and the people in or by his hand, whereby he in a manner covered them, that no harm might come to them. When it says they sat at thy feet, that means like scholars to receive instructions. He alludes to the place where the people waited when the law was delivered, which was at the foot of the mount. So, and this is something in ancient Near Eastern tradition. When there's a master or a teacher, there's students learning from that master. Their place is at the feet of the master, and they would literally just sit down and listen to him talk. So one of the definitions of a disciple is one who sits at the feet of a master, who listens, that's a humble learning position. They sit at the feet of a master. Here at Sinai, it was even greater, where God sat enthroned on top of a mountain and the people were at the base of that mountain. But it's a similar posture of students waiting to learn from a master who is terrifying, but the terrifying display is not meant as it's partly a threat, but it's also a divine promise. He gave them a pure and wonderful thing, the law. In verse 3, when it talks about everyone shall receive of thy words, everyone of the people will receive or submit to thy instructions and commands. This may respect either the people's promise when they heard the law that they would hear and do all that was commanded, or just their duty to do so. In verse 4, it talks about Moses again. Quote, Moses commanded us a law, even the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. Moses speaks of himself in the third person, J.W. says, which is very unusual in the Hebrew language. The law is called their inheritance because the obligation of it was hereditary, passing from parents to their children, and because this was the best part of their inheritance, the greatest of all those gifts which God bestowed upon them. So yeah, Moses speaks about himself in the third person, which is weird for him, and then he notes that the law is called an inheritance because it gets passed on from generation to generation. Then it talks in verse 5, he was king in Jeshurun when the heads of the people and the tribes of Israel were gathered together. I think he's talking about himself again. Moses was their king, not in title, but in reality, being under God, their supreme governor and lawgiver. When it said, so Jeshurun is the title given to Israel in the previous chapter, I believe. If it wasn't last chapter, it was the chapter before. I think it was the previous chapter. Yep, in verse 15 of chapter 32, that's when it's used for the first time. But Jeshurun waxed fat. Now 32 is all bad stuff about the tribes of Israel. 33 seems to be mostly positive. Not quite making up for 32. But, this is kind of a positive spin on a negative chapter prior to this. But whenever Moses is talking about himself as king in Jeshurun, he's establishing, he was the leader. when the heads of the people and the tribes of Israel were gathered together. And that means when the princes and people met together for the management of public affairs, Moses was owned by them as their king and lawgiver. In verse 6, there's the phrase, let Reuben live and not die, and let not his men be few. Though Reuben deserved to be cut off or greatly diminished and obscured according to Jacob's prediction in Genesis 49 verse 4, it's because he slept with Jacob's wife. Yeah, his son, one of his sons slept with one of his sister mothers. I think that's what they call them in the Mormon faith. You have your actual mother, and then you have other wives of your father. I think they're called sister mothers. Anyway, he slept with his stepmother. Yeah, that's what, yeah. Yet God will spare them and give them a name and a portion among the tribes of Israel and bless them with increase of their numbers. All the ancient paraphrasts refer this to the other world. So far were they from expecting temporal blessings only. Let Reuben live in life eternal, says Onkelos. I think that's a Greek thinker. And not die the second death. Let Reuben live in this world, so Jonathan and the Jerusalem Targum, and not die that death which the wicked die in the world to come. So, I forget what Targums are. Yeah, I don't know enough about this to speak in an intelligent way, but here there's a metaphorical reading to this blessing towards Reuben. Even though he doesn't deserve a blessing because of what he did, he still gets one because the Lord is gracious, and then the nature of that blessing is what he's talking about after that, where there's a literal blessing, but there's also a metaphorical or a spiritual blessing that it points to. In verse 7 it says, hear, Lord, quote, and this is the blessing of Judah, and he said, hear, Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him unto his people. God will hear his prayer for the accomplishment of those things promised to that tribe in Genesis 49, 8 through 12. This implies the days and difficulties Judah would meet with that would drive him to his prayers, which would be with success. Verse 7 says, hear, Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him unto his people. When it says unto his people, J.W. says, when he shall go forth to battle against his enemies, and shall fiercely fall upon them, as was foretold in 49 verses 8 and 9. It says, bring him back with honor and victory to his people, to the rest of his tribe who were left at home when their brethren went to battle, and to his brethren the other tribes of Israel. When it says, let his hands be sufficient for him, this is still in verse 7, let his hands be sufficient for him, and be thou a help to him from his enemies. This tribe shall be so numerous and potent that it shall suffice to defend itself without any aid, either from foreign nations or from other tribes, as appeared when this tribe alone was able to grapple with 9 or 10 of the other tribes. When it says, save him from his enemies, thou wilt preserve this tribe in a special manner, so that his enemies shall not be able to ruin it as they will do other tribes, and that for the sake of the Messiah who shall spring up out of it. So this is the tribe Judah that's being blessed here. They're being blessed militarily and in numbers, and it will so happen here in, 100, 150 years that there will be a split between all the other tribes in Judah, and Judah is going to be able to defend itself better than all the other confederated tribes. And the Messiah is going to come out of that tribe. In verse 8, there's a blessing towards the Urim and the Thummim. These are special lots that sat within the breastplate of the high priest, who of course was of the family of Levi. So verse 8 is the blessing of the tribe of family, the tribe of Levi. Quote, and of Levi he said, let thy Thummim and thy Urim be with thy Holy One, whom thou didst prove at Massah, and with whom thou didst strive at the waters of Meribah. So Massah and Meribah are the waters of bitterness where people strove with God. It's also associated with the story where spies came back who surveyed the Holy Land and came back saying, The children of Anak are there, giants, and we cannot invade. We can't succeed. And so God cursed them, and that's why they had to walk in the wilderness for 40 years. So the Urim and the Thummim are, casting lots as a way of deciding things or divining things. The high priest was the only one allowed to enter into God's holy presence, the Ark of the Covenant. But he had a breastplate, and within it sat the Urim and the Thummim. JW says, the Thummim and the Urim, which are thine, O Lord, by special institution and consecration, by which he understands the ephod, in which they were put, ephod is the breastplate, and the high priesthood, to which they were appropriated, and with all the gifts and graces. Sorry, one second. Yeah. And with all the gifts and graces signified by the Urim and Thummim, and necessary for the discharge of that high office, shall be with thy Holy One, that is, with that priest, whom thou hast consecrated to thyself, and who is holy in a more peculiar manner than all the people were. That is, the priesthood shall be confined to and continued in Aaron's family. So there's a larger tribe of Levi, and within that tribe is Aaron, the first high priest. And priests could only come from Aaron's family, according to JW here. When it talks about that phrase, who thou didst prove, this is still in verse 8. Let the Thummim and the Urim be with the Holy One, whom thou didst prove at Massah. It means, although thou didst try the Lord and rebuke him, although the Lord did try him and rebuke him, Levi, yet thou didst not take away the priesthood from him. Okay, yeah, that's the clear meaning. When it talks about at Massah, not at the Massah mentioned in Exodus chapter 17, verse 7, which is also called Meribah, but at that other Meribah in Numbers chapter 20, verse 13, thou didst strive, whom thou didst reprove and chastise. Yeah, so when it talks about Massah and Meribah, there seem to be two different places, according to JW. There's Exodus 17:7 and Numbers 20, verse 13. I'm looking up Exodus 17:7. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? So, yeah, that's just a place where they cried unto the Lord. They fought with Amalek there. Okay, yeah, this is where there was no water, and they complained against Moses. So that's in Exodus 17. Now Numbers chapter 20, verses 13. Numbers 20, verse 13. This is the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel strove with the Lord, and he was sanctified in them. So that's where Moses did it wrong and upset the Lord. But in both places, he gave them water to drink from the rock. This is something I need to do more research on, because I still haven't got clear on the geography of the exile. Yeah, I'm sorry. Let's go on. Verse 9. The phrase is, I have not seen him. Quote, who said unto his father and to his mother, we're still on Levi, I have not seen him. That is, I have no respect unto them. The sense is, who followed God and his command fully, and executed the judgment enjoined by God without any respect of persons. And he references Exodus 32, verses 26 and 27. So, according to JW, this is just a statement of impartiality on the part of the priesthood. They're not going to show favoritism between humans based on worldly standards. when it says they kept thy covenant, quote, neither did he acknowledge his brethren, nor knew his own children, for they have observed thy word and kept thy covenant. When the rest broke their covenant with God by that foul sin of idolatry with the calf, that tribe kept themselves pure from that infection and adhered to God and his worship. So it's saying, the golden calf episode, whenever the Israelites chose idolatry, it's saying that Levi stayed pure, even though the other tribes fell into idolatry. If I recall correctly, when Moses comes down and executes God's judgment on them, he gets the priests, says, everybody rally on me, and then they get their swords out and they just walk through and just start slaughtering the people Israel. Yeah, that was crazy. All right, verse 11 talks about his substance. Bless the Lord his substance and accept the work of his hands. I don't think we're on Levi anymore, are we? No, I think we are. Smite through the loins of them that rise against him, and of them that hate him, that they rise not again. Because he hath no inheritance in his own, and therefore wholly depends upon thy blessing. So it's asking the Lord to bless Levi materially, even though they don't have an inheritance in the land. We've talked about that before. When it talks about the work of his hands, accept the work of his hands, saying, accept all his holy administrations, which he fitly calls the work of his hands, because a great part of the service of the Levites and priests was done by the labor of their hand and body, whereas the service of evangelical ministers is more spiritual and heavenly. So the priests were butchers, and literally people would bring sacrifices to them, and then they would execute those animals, chop them up, and then do different things with different body parts. They were handling blood and meat, sinew, bone all the time. It's very physical work. So yeah, he compares and contrasts that to the work of a priest or preacher in the Christian faith. And yeah, we're not butchers. We have the sacrifice that Christ made for us, and we observe the sacrament of communion, but that's just breaking bread and serving wine. It's nothing akin to what the priest does. When it talks about smiting, smite through the loins of them that rise against him, Moses prays thus earnestly for them, because he foresaw they who were to teach and reprove and chastise others would have many enemies, and because they were under God, the great preservers and upholders of religion, and their enemies were the enemies of religion itself. So these are the guys going to be telling the truth to people who don't want to hear the truth. So Lord, defend them, and in fact, hurt those who hurt them. If you read through the Old Testament, though, it doesn't seem to me like the priests did a very good job defending the faith against their people. In verse 12, it talks about Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin is put next to Levi because the temple where the work of the Levites lay was upon the edge of the lot of this tribe. And 'tis put before Joseph because of the dignity of Jerusalem, part of which was in this lot above Samaria, which was the tribe of Ephraim. Likewise, because Benjamin adhered to the house of David and to the temple of God, when the rest of the tribes deserted both. So Judah is the tribe of where Jerusalem was. It's saying that Benjamin bordered on this area, and that's why it's given preferential treatment. Maybe. Yeah. When it calls him the beloved of the Lord, quote, and of Benjamin he said, the beloved of the Lord shall dwell in safety by him. It's so called in allusion to their father Benjamin, who was the beloved of his father Jacob. And because of the kindness of God, Benjamin was the baby of the family. He was loved by Jacob big time. And because of the kindness of God to this tribe, which appeared both in this, that they dwelt in the best part of the land, as Josephus affirms, that's a historian of Jesus' era, slightly after. And in the following privilege, he shall dwell in safety by him, is what it says. He shall have his lot nigh to God's temple, which was both a singular comfort and safeguard to him. When it says shall cover, quote, and the Lord shall cover him all the day long, that means he shall protect that tribe continually while they cleave to him. When it says, and he shall dwell between his shoulders, he is the Lord. The Lord shall dwell, that is, his temple shall be placed between his shoulders, that is, in his portion, or between his borders, as the word shoulder is often used. And this was truly the situation of the temple, on both sides whereof was Benjamin's portion. And though Mount Sion was in the tribe of Judah, yet Mount Moriah, on which the temple was built, was in the tribe of Benjamin. Is that so? Is that really so? I got a map at the back of this Bible. What do you know? I had never realized that Benjamin... So the funny thing is, Jerusalem is divided up between Palestinian and Israeli property today. And it seems that Benjamin actually had possession of part of Jerusalem. The thing here, to be clear, if you're going, well, this doesn't make sense, the temple wasn't built yet. You're absolutely right. But the thing is, there's a prophetic vision here. So there's already a preference shown for certain tribes based on proximity to where God would lay himself in the future. Rest himself. Identify himself. I'll go ahead and show you this map. I'm looking at this map. It shows how the 12 tribes were divided out. If you go through Joshua with me, it's going to say where all the different tribes were, and you can find a map like that online for free. But it's really helpful for going through the Old Testament, because it's not like they refer to the 12 tribes only these few times. Like it really determines ancient Israelite history for a long way, through many books. In verse 13, it talks about Joseph. This includes the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. In Jacob's blessing, that of Joseph is the largest. And so it is here. So when it talks about his land, quote, and of Joseph he said, blessed of the Lord be his land. His portion shall be endowed with the choice blessings from God. When it talks about heaven, for the precious things of heaven, for the dew and for the deep that coucheth beneath, that is the precious fruits of the earth brought forth by the influences of heaven, the warmth of the sun and the rain which God will send from heaven. And when it talks about the deep, that means the springs of water bubbling out of the earth. Perhaps it may likewise refer to the great deep, the abyss of waters, which is supposed to be contained in the earth. So this is just kind of summoning the different realms to be a blessing to the tribes of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Verse 14, it talks about the sun, by the sun, and for the precious fruits brought forth by the sun, and for the precious things put forth by the moon. The sun, which opens and warms the earth, cherishes and improves, and in due time ripens the seeds and fruits of it. And when it talks about the moon, which by its moisture refreshes and promotes them. In Hebrew, of the moons or months, that is, which it bringeth forth in the several months or seasons of the year. That might be a better rendering. Verse 15, it talks about the chief things, quote, and for the chief things of the ancient mountains, and for the precious things of the lasting hills. The chief things, that is the excellent fruits, as grapes, olives, figs, etc., which delight in mountains, growing upon, or precious minerals contained in their mountains and hills, called ancient and everlasting, that is, such as have been from the beginning of the world, and are likely to continue to the end of it, in opposition to those hills or mounts which have been cast up by man. So there was a notion that mountains were eternal, and so that's why it's associated with holy things. Verse 16, the phrase "and for," quote, "and for the precious things of the earth and fullness thereof." J.W. says, "and in general for all the choice fruits which the land produceth and all parts of it, whether hills or valleys." When it talks about the fullness thereof, that is the plants and cattle and all creatures that grow, increase, and flourish in it. Talks about the goodwill, and for the goodwill of him that dwelt in the bush. For all other effects of the goodwill and kindness of God, who not long since did for a time dwell or appear in the bush to me, in order to the relief of his people. He's talking about the Lord manifesting in the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, verse 2. When it talks about of Joseph, quote, "let the blessing come upon the head of Joseph and upon the top of the head of him that was separated from his brethren," that is, of Joseph's posterity. Him that was separated from his brethren, it's talking about Joseph's brethren separated him from them by making him a slave, and God distinguished him from them by making him a prince. This is in Genesis, if you haven't read it before. The preceding words might be rendered, "my dweller in the bush." That was an appearance of the divine majesty to Moses only, in token of his particular favor. Many a time had God appeared to Moses, but now he is just dying. He seems to have the most pleasing remembrance of the first time that he saw the visions of the Almighty. It was here God declared himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so confirmed the promise made to the Father, that promise which our Lord shows reaches as far as the resurrection and eternal life. So as he brings up the bush here in verse 16, J.W. says he's just randomly meditating on the blessing of that divine visage. Okay. In verse 17, it says his glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. I think it's talking about Joseph. When it talks about a bullock, J.W. says, or young bull, which is a stately creature, and was therefore formerly used as an emblem of royal majesty. This seems to note the kingdom which Ephraim should obtain in Jeroboam and his successors. When it talks about his horns, it means his strength and power, and they shall be very great. When it talks about the people in verse 17, quote, with them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth. Here it means all that shall oppose him. So the people are enemies of Ephraim, and particularly the Canaanites. And when it talks about the 10,000s, quote, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh, it's talking about of the land of Canaan. Though Manasseh be now more numerous, yet Ephraim shall shortly outstrip him, as was foretold in Genesis 49, 17 through 19. So clearly there's a lot of overlap between these verses and Genesis 49. We've referenced that several times. In verse 18, the word rejoice is used. And of Zebulun he said, rejoice, Zebulun, in thy going out, and Issachar in thy tents. Zebulun should rejoice. Thou shalt prosper and have cause of rejoicing in thy going out. 1, to war, as this phrase is often used, and 2, to sea in way of traffic, because their portion lay near the sea. It's talking about Zebulun, right? Yeah, Zebulun, their portion is going to be by the sea, so they're going to go out onto the sea. And in both respects, his course is opposite to that of Issachar, who was a lover of peace and pasturage. So Zebulun goes to war and he goes to sea. Issachar, who it then turns immediately to, doesn't go to war much and doesn't go out to sea, likes the land. He is here joined with Zebulun, both because they were brethren by father and mother, they shared the same mother, and because their possessions lay near together. And when it talks about in thy tents, and Issachar in thy tents, thou shalt give thyself to the management of laud and cattle, living quietly in thine own possessions. Okay. In verse 19, it talks about they, quote, they shall call the people unto the mountain. There they shall offer sacrifices of righteousness, for they shall suck of the abundance of the seas and of treasures hid in the sand. Here, JW says they is Zebulun again. It's not Issachar. Zebulun, of whom Moses takes more special notice. And so, having dispatched Issachar in 2 words, he returns to Zebulun. When it talks about the people here, they shall call the people unto the mountain. They shall offer sacrifices of righteousness. The people are the Gentiles, either those in Galilee, which was called Galilee of the Gentiles, who were their neighbors, or people of other nations with whom they had commerce, which they endeavored to improve in persuading them to worship the true God. So he's saying Zebulun is going to be a sort of evangelistic tribe calling Gentiles to the worship of the one true God. And then it says they will call them to the mountain, that is to the Temple Mount, which Moses knew was to be seated upon a mountain. Sacrifices of righteousness, it talks about they shall offer sacrifices of righteousness, such as God requires. Their trafficking abroad with heathen nations shall not make them forget their duty at home, nor shall their distance from the place of sacrifice hinder them from coming to it to discharge that duty. When it talks about how they will suck of the abundance of the sea, they shall grow rich by the traffic of the sea, and shall consecrate themselves and their riches to God. When it says something's going to be hid in the sand, yeah, they will suck of the abundance of the seas and of treasures hid in the sand. Such precious things as either 1 are contained in the sand of the sea and rivers, in which sometimes there is mixed a considerable quantity of gold and silver. 2, such as grow in the sea or are fetched from sandy bottoms of it, such as pearls, coral, ambergris. I don't know what that is. What's ambergris? Flammable substance of a dull gray or blackish color produced in the digestive system of sperm whales. Freshly produced ambergris has a marine fecal odor. It acquires a sweet earthy scent as it ages, commonly likened to the fragrance of, and it cuts off there. That's from Wikipedia, so maybe it's used for burning. The treasures hidden in the sand can also, 3rd, refer to such as being cast into the sea by shipwreck or cast upon the shore by the workings of the sea. It were well if the enlargement of our trade with foreign countries were made to contribute to the spreading of the gospel. That last part doesn't seem to be at all connected to the 3 things that could be treasures in the sand. I think that's a theological reflection. There's a movement called, I think it's called Made to Flourish. It's a network of pastors that are of the conviction that when we're ministering to our people, the primary work of the church is not done in the church building, but it's done by the people as they go out into the world. So the notion is that believers in God, as they go out into the world to do commerce, to trade, that we should be doing so as emissaries of God, as the tribe of Zebulun here does. And 20 talks about enlarging, quote, and of Gad, he said, blessed be he that enlargeth Gad. That means that brings him out of his straits amid troubles, which he was often engaged in because he was encompassed with potent enemies. So Gad apparently has a rough time in the future. When it talks about as a lion, he dwelleth as a lion and teareth the arm with the crown of his head. That means safe and secure from his enemies and terrible to them when they rouse and molest him. When it says he teareth the arm, that means he utterly destroys his enemies, both the head, the seat of the crown, their dignity and principality, and the arm, the subject of strength and instrument of action, both chief princes and their subjects. Okay. When it talks about the first part, quote, and he provided the first part for himself. This is verse 21, because there in a portion of the lawgiver was he seated. The first fruits of the land of promise, the country of Sihon, which was first conquered, which he is said to provide for himself, because he desired and obtained it of Moses. We're still talking about Gad here. When it talks about of the lawgiver, that's Moses, whose portion This is called either because this part of the land beyond Jordan was the only part of the land which Moses was permitted to enter upon, or because it was given him by Moses, whereas the portions beyond Jordan were given to the several tribes by Joshua according to the direction of the lot. So Gad, so there's the river Jordan, and the promised land lies on the west side of it. This is west for y'all. And then Moses was actually able to come up to the river Jordan on the east side, and it was there that they destroyed Sihon and Og, and then gave their land to the tribes of Gad and blank, I forget the second one, and then half the tribe of Manasseh. So here, this is the region where Moses actually was able to enter into. When it talks about a portion of the lawgiver, was he seated? In Hebrew, that means hidden or protected. For their wives and children were secured in their cities, while many of their men went to war in Canaan. So Moses didn't want to give them that land on the west of the Jordan, because then they would be prone to just stay there and not go to war with their brethren against the inhabitants of Canaan. So it's just saying they hid their children and their wives there while the men went out to war. When it says he came, quote, and he came with the heads of the people, he executed justice of the Lord and his judgments with Israel. That means he went or he will go to war in Canaan with the princes or captains or rulers of the people of Israel. That is, under the command and conduct, as indeed they did, or with the first of the people, or in the front of the people, as the Syriac renders it. For this tribe and their brethren whose lot fell beyond Jordan were to march into Canaan before their brethren. So they were supposed to march in the front. When it says he executed the justice of the Lord, that means the just judgment of God against the Canaanites, as the rest of the Israelites did. So as it's been saying, he, it's talking about Gad personified in an individual. In verse 22, it talks about a lion's whelp, quote, and of Dan he said, Dan is a lion's whelp, he shall leap from Bashan. That means courageous and generous and strong and successful against his enemies. And when it says, when he leapeth from Bashan, because there were many and fierce lions in those parts, whence they used to come forth and leap upon prey. So Bashan was this region that we already talked about was great for cattle, but apparently there were lots of lions there who would leap out. Or this may refer either to the particular victories obtained by Samson, who was of the tribe of Daniel, or to a more general achievement of that tribe when a party of them surprised Laish, which lay in the farthest part of the land of Canaan from them, and the mountain of Bashan lying not far from that city, from whence they probably made their descent upon it, thus leaping from Bashan. Okay. Verse 23, it talks about being satisfied with favor. Quote, and of Naphtali he said, O Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full with the blessing of the Lord, possess thou the west and the south. When it says they're satisfied with favor, that means with the favor of God. That only is the favor that satisfies the soul. They are happy indeed that have the favor of God, and they shall have it, that place their satisfaction in it. And full with the blessing of the Lord, not only with corn, wine, and oil, the fruit of the blessing, but with the blessing itself, the grace of God, according to his promise and covenant. When it says, possess thou the west and the south, or the sea and the south, this is not to be understood of the place that his lot should fall there, for he was rather in the east and the north of the land, but of the pleasures and commodities of the west, or of the sea, which were conveyed to him from his neighbor Zebulun, and of the south, that is, from the southern tribes and parts of Canaan, which were brought to him down the river Jordan, and both sorts of commodities were given him in exchange for the fruitful, rich soil which he had in great abundance. All right, verse 24, let Asher, man, this is taking longer than I thought. We're at an hour. Let Asher who carries blessedness in his very name, be blessed with children. Let's see, that was verse 24. And of Asher he said, let Asher be blessed with children, let him be acceptable to his brethren, and let him dip his foot in oil. When it says, let him be blessed with his children, he shall have numerous, strong, and healthful children. When it says, may he be acceptable to his brethren, that means by his sweet disposition and winning carriage. When it says, let him dip his foot in oil, he shall have such plenty of oil that he may not only wash his face, but his feet also in it. So the notion, so they didn't have soap back then. When they washed, they would cover their skin in oil and then scrape it off. The oil would bond with any residue on their skin, and then when they scraped it off, it would get any dirt off. JW here is saying that oil, they weren't just like swimming in it, so they would just use it on their face. They didn't have enough for their entire bodies, but here may Asher have so much oil that they can use it on their entire bodies, even their feet. In verse 25, it talks about iron and brass on their feet. Quote, thy shoes shall be iron and brass, and as thy days, so shall thy strength be. The mines of iron and copper, which were in their portion, whence Sidon, their neighbor, was famous among the heathens for its plenty of brass, and Sarepta is thought to have its name from the brass and iron, which were melted there in great quantity. I don't know anything about that. In verse 25, when it says, thy strength, and as thy days, so shall thy strength be. Thy strength shall not be diminished with age, but thou shalt have the vigor of youth even in thine old age. Thy tribe shall grow stronger and stronger. Verse 26, there is none, quote, there is none like unto the God of Jeshurun, who rideth upon the heaven in thy help, and in his excellency on the sky. Remember, Jeshurun is Israel, so the God of Jeshurun is the Lord. These are the last words that ever Moses wrote, perhaps the greatest writer that ever lived upon the earth. And this man of God, who had as much reason to know both as ever any mere man had, with his last breath magnifies both the God of Israel and the Israel of God. Unto the God of Jeshurun, who to help thee rideth upon the heaven, and with the greatest state and magnificence on the sky. Riding on the heaven denotes the greatness and glory in which he manifests himself to the upper world, and the use he makes of the influences of heaven and the products of the clouds, in bringing to pass his own counsels in the lower world. All these he manages and directs, as a man doth the horse he rides on. Okay. Verse 27, it talks about the eternal God. Quote, the eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He who was before all worlds and will be when time shall be no more. That's the eternal God. Whenever talks about the eternal God is thy refuge, when it talks about refuge, or thy habitation, or mansion, or house, so the word signifies, in whom thou art safe and easy and at rest, as a man is in his own house. Every true Israelite is at home in God. The soul returns to him and reposes in him. And they that make him their habitation shall have all the comforts and benefits of an habitation in him. And underneath are the everlasting arms. What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. A lot of people don't know the words of our hymns are many of them come directly from Scripture. When it talks about the everlasting arms, that's the almighty power of God, which protects and comforts all that trust in him in their greatest straits and distresses. He shall thrust out the enemy from before thee. He shall make room for thee by his resistless power, and shall say, destroy them. That's in verse 27. And he shall thrust out his enemy before thee, and shall say, destroy them. Oh, so it doesn't say anything about his resistless power in here, but the destroy them is there. It gives the Israelites not only a commission, but strength to put that destruction in execution. And has he not given the same commission and the same strength to believers to destroy all sin? So in Ephesians, there's a key text that says, we're called to battle, but not against the worldly. For we are not fighting enemies of flesh and blood, but we are fighting the powers, the principalities, the forces of darkness in the heavenly realms. So the ancient Israelites were called to do warfare against flesh and blood, namely the people of Canaan. But J.W. turns this into a message for us who are called to do spiritual warfare against the powers of darkness, and how the Lord tells us this similar commission: go out and destroy. In verse 28, it talks about the word alone. Quote, Israel then shall dwell in safety alone. That can have two different meanings according to J.W. One is, though they be alone and have no confederates to defend them, but have all the world against them, yet my single protection shall be sufficient for them. Or, they are distinct and separated from all other nations, with whom I will not have them mingle themselves. Okay. In 28, when it talks about a fountain, the fountain of Jacob shall be upon a land of corn and wine. The fountain is, that is the posterity of Jacob, which flowed from him as waters from a fountain in great abundance. So that's the 12 sons that eventually are responsible for the 12 tribes. The fountain is here put for the river or streams which flow from it, as Jacob or Israel, who is the fountain, is often put for the children of Israel. And then when it talks about his heavens shall drop down dew, that means those heavens or that air which hangs over his land. Okay. Now the final verse that we have a note on is verse 29, the shield of thy help. Quote, happy art thou, O Israel, who is like unto thee, O people saved by the Lord, the shield of thy help. It's describing the Lord there, by whom thou art sufficiently guarded against all assailants, and the sword of thy excellency. Or thy most excellent sword, that is thy strength and the author of all thy past or approaching victories. Those in whose hearts is the excellency of holiness, have God himself for their shield and sword. They are defended by the whole armor of God. That's a quote from Ephesians. His word is their sword, and faith their shield. That also ties into Hebrews, where it talks about the sword of the Spirit, the word. And thine enemies shall be found liars unto thee. That was a quote. Thine enemies shall be found liars unto thee, who said that they would destroy thee, or at least that they would never submit, and thou shalt tread upon their high places. That's another quote from verse 29. Their strongholds, palaces, and temples. Thus shall the God of peace tread Satan under the feet of all believers, and that shortly. So once again, JW is spiritualizing the messages of the Old Testament and contextualizing them within the contemporary church. And he's not wrong. We are called to spiritual warfare. One of the things that I found revealing, I've asked in several different churches, is do you folks identify as civilians or as warriors? And most often, people identify as civilians within the church. And I think sometimes they don't understand what I'm asking, but sometimes they do. A lot of people don't realize that they're called to go to battle for the Lord, that there's a spiritual battle going on at all times, and that we've been inducted into God's holy campaign. But that's the situation. So, Christian warriors, go forth and conquer. Have a good day.